Imagine a world where the sound of rainfall is never ending. Day after day, night after night, the skies open and the downpour continues without pause. Storm clouds blanket the heavens. Thunder rolls across oceans and continents, and rivers overflow until they merge into vast inland seas. In this world, the sun is veiled, stars never shine, and every living thing must adjust to a planet where water falls endlessly. This is not merely a storm lasting days or weeks. It is not a season of monsoons, nor even a century of wet years. It is rain that continues for millions of years. This is not fantasy. Earth has endured episodes of near constant rainfall before, recorded in stone and sediment. One of the most famous is known as the Carnian pluvial episode, a climatic shift around 230 million years ago that transformed the environment for nearly 2 million years. During this time, rain swept across continents, reshaping ecosystems, triggering extinctions, and paving the way for new evolutionary opportunities. What would it be like to live in such a world? What happened to Earth's surface, its oceans, its plants and animals, when the skies refused to clear? If you're already feeling settled into this story, it would mean a lot if you gave this video a gentle like. And if you'd like to hear more journeys like this, consider subscribing. I'd also love to know, where in the world are you listening from tonight? Rain is both life-giving and destructive. It nourishes forests, fills rivers, and supports the endless cycle of ecosystems. But when rain becomes relentless, it reshapes everything it touches. Floods spread across valleys, mountains crumble under erosion, and coastlines drown beneath rising seas. Rainfall is not just weather, it is a geological force. Over centuries and millennia, endless precipitation has the strength to transform continents, bury ancient landscapes, and change the chemistry of oceans. Think of the familiar cycle of a storm today. Dark clouds gather, drops begin to fall, rivers swell, and eventually the skies clear. In the deep past, that clearing never came. Instead, storms fed upon themselves, fueled by volcanic gases, greenhouse warming, and altered ocean currents. Imagine this not as a passing disturbance, but as the new normal of Earth. To understand what happened during Earth's multi-million year reigns, we must picture the world before the storms began. Earth was already alive with ecosystems. Plants colonized the land, amphibians and reptiles thrived, and vast forests reached across continents. Oceans teemed with invertebrates, fish, and early reptiles. The climate was relatively stable, supporting predictable environments where life could flourish. But deep beneath the crust, forces were stirring. Tectonic plates shifted, volcanoes erupted on colossal scales, and gases built up in the atmosphere. The delicate balance of temperature, circulation, and precipitation tipped. Once that balance was broken, the rains began. When rain falls without end, the results ripple through every corner of the biosphere. Rivers widen into torrents that carve through valleys. Soils, waterlogged and stripped of nutrients, collapse into mud. Plants adapted to dry spells wither, while others seize the advantage and spread across newly wet landscapes. Lakes and inland seas swell until they consume entire regions. In the oceans, increased rainfall brings floods of sediment from eroded land. Rivers dump minerals and nutrients into coastal waters, fueling blooms of life, and at times, toxic dead zones. Rising seas swallow low-lying regions, connecting previously separate ecosystems. Life on land and in water is caught between adaptation and extinction. For many creatures, the endless rain spelled disaster. Reptiles and amphibians, reliant on dry nesting grounds, struggle to reproduce. Plants unable to withstand soggy soils vanished. Entire ecosystems collapsed beneath the weight of unending storms. Yet where old life perished, new life emerged. The endless rains were not simply destructive. They were a crucible for change. Those that could adapt found new opportunities. Amphibians thrived in waterlogged environments. Reptiles capable of endurance and versatility survived. Insects spread rapidly, taking advantage of wet forests. And deep within the shadows of this turbulent world, early dinosaurs began their rise. How do we know this happened? The rocks remember. Sedimentary layers bear the fingerprints of 2 million years of storms. Mudstones and sandstones show cycles of flooding, deposition, and erosion. Fossils reveal sudden turnovers in species, with some vanishing abruptly and others appearing for the first time. Chemical signatures in ancient soils record an atmosphere heavy with carbon dioxide and rainfall beyond measure. By piecing together this evidence, scientists have reconstructed one of the wettest chapters in Earth's history. What emerges is not just a record of rain, but a story of survival, adaptation, and transformation on a planetary scale. Today, the idea of endless rain often appears in myth, story, and imagination. Ancient cultures told tales of great floods that reshaped the world. Modern stories imagine dystopian worlds drowned in storms. But Earth itself has already lived through something more dramatic than any myth. The 2 million year reign was not symbolic. It was real, and its effects still echo through the evolution of life and the shaping of continents. In this documentary, we will journey through this extraordinary time in Earth's past. We will explore the world before the rains, the storm that began and refused to end, the flooded landscapes and drowned continents, the creatures that struggled and those that thrived, and the legacy the rains left behind. As you listen, imagine the steady sound of rain, gentle, endless, soothing. Though in reality, it was an age of upheaval. We will tell the story calmly, drifting through each scene as though carried on a quiet current. We will discover not just destruction, but renewal, Not just endings, but beginnings. So let us begin. The skies are heavy with clouds. The first drops are falling. Soon, the world will change forever. Before the sky darkened and the endless storms began, Earth was already a planet in motion, alive, shifting, and restless. Continents drifted, mountains rose, oceans surged, and life carved out its niches. To understand what happened when rain poured for millions of years, we must first picture the calm before the deluge. This was not a calm in the sense of stillness, but rather the relative balance of climate, ecosystems, and geology that existed before the storm clouds took permanent residence above the world. The chapter of history we focus on falls deep in the Mesozoic era, during a time known as the Carnian stage of the Triassic period, around 230 million years ago. Dinosaurs had only just begun their journey, and they were not yet the dominant rulers of the land. Instead, Earth was filled with a mosaic of reptiles, amphibians, insects, and early plants that together formed vibrant ecosystems. The continents looked very different. Land masses were fused into the vast supercontinent Pangaea, stretching from pole to pole. This single landmass shaped climates in unusual ways. Interiors of the continent were dry, scorched by heat in summer and chilled in winter. Coasts were more temperate, influenced by surrounding oceans. Rainfall was scarce in many inland regions, leaving deserts and semi-arid plains. Rivers wound through basins, but great stretches of land remained parched, dusty, and vulnerable to drought. Against this backdrop of dryness, the sudden arrival of endless rain would prove catastrophic. Imagine traveling across Pangaea before the storm. You would begin in a barren interior, with vast dunes stretching across horizons, similar to the Sahara of today, but larger and more extreme. Sparse plants clung to riverbanks, while hardy shrubs and ferns survived in pockets of moisture. Large reptiles stalked these environments. Some ambush predators, others slow-moving herbivores feeding on scattered vegetation. Moving toward the coasts, the scenery shifted. Coniferous forests stretched across humid regions, filled with cycads and ginkgo-like plants. Swamps and river valleys supported amphibians and early reptiles, including ancestors of crocodiles. Seas teemed with ammonites, fish, and early marine reptiles. Life concentrated in these wetter coastal regions, while the continental interior remained dry and difficult. Above it all, the atmosphere was heavy with carbon dioxide, released by volcanic activity. The greenhouse effect kept global temperatures high, but climates were uneven. Some regions experienced regular monsoons, while others endured long droughts. In this world, stability was fragile, held in a balance easily disrupted. Life thrived in surprising diversity during this pre-rain age. Amphibians lived in rivers and lakes, their moist skins suited to aquatic habitats. Reptiles spread across the land, experimenting with new forms, some armored, some fast and agile. Insects buzzed among the forests, already playing vital roles in pollination and decomposition. Plants were central to these ecosystems. Conifers towered above landscapes, their needle-like leaves adapted to withstand both drought and seasonal rainfall. Ferns and horsetails thrived in wetlands, forming dense mats along riverbanks. Cycads, with their palm-like fronds, spread widely, creating food for herbivores. Dinosaurs were present, but small and relatively rare. They had yet to rise as the giants of the Mesozoic. Instead, they competed with a wide variety of other reptiles, many of which would later vanish when climate shifted. Though this world might appear stable, the signs of vulnerability were there. Soils in dry regions were thin and easily eroded. Rivers were seasonal, swelling during rains, but vanishing into dust during dry months. Animals depended on predictable patterns of wet and dry seasons to reproduce and survive. Plants were adapted to extremes, but struggled when pushed beyond their tolerances. The balance of life and climate was delicately poised. Even small disruptions could trigger local extinctions. And beneath Earth's surface, powerful forces were preparing to test this fragile system. The stage for endless rain was set by tectonic and volcanic activity. Pangaea was beginning to crack, and as the supercontinent shifted, massive volcanic eruptions poured greenhouse gases into the air. These eruptions darkened skies with ash and released immense amounts of carbon dioxide and methane. The atmosphere thickened, warming the planet unevenly. Oceans absorbed some of the excess carbon, altering chemistry and circulation patterns. Winds shifted, drawing moisture into new regions. The result was a climate primed for disruption. When conditions aligned, the cycle began. Oceans evaporated more water into the air. Storm systems intensified, and rainfall increased. Normally, such changes might last decades or centuries. But in this case, the system locked into a new state. The rains began and did not stop. For the creatures of Pangaea, the world before the rain was already one of survival. Many species clung to habitats where water was reliable. Amphibians gathered in shrinking ponds during dry seasons. Reptiles laid eggs in sandy soils, counting on predictable warmth. Plants adapted to arid zones grew slowly, conserving every drop of water. When the rains began, none could have foreseen the scale of what was coming. A storm was no stranger to these landscapes. Seasonal monsoons swept across the land, as they do today in parts of Asia. But this time, the storms did not retreat. The cycle broke and the downpour continued. It is worth pausing here to reflect on the contrast. The earth before the rains was not static, but it was familiar in its rhythms. Drought followed rain, and rain followed drought. Ecosystems were shaped around this pattern, with plants and animals synchronized to seasonal cycles. The rains that would follow erased these rhythms entirely. The endless storm was not merely a change in weather. It was a transformation of the planet's very identity. Dry lands drowned, forests collapsed, rivers became seas, and life was forced into crisis. As the first dark clouds gathered, the world waited unknowingly. Volcanoes roared in the distance. Winds shifted, carrying moisture where it had not reached before. Lightning split skies above deserts, and the first drops fell on sand that had not seen rain in years. At first, it was a blessing. Dry rivers filled, plants flourished, animals drank deeply. But as days became months, and months became centuries, the blessing became a burden. Rain without end was unlike anything Earth had ever experienced. And so began the transformation that would last 2 million years. The Earth had always known storms. Lightning flashed across ancient skies long before life ever crawled from the oceans. Rain had fallen on barren rock, carving valleys and feeding the first rivers that carried minerals into seas. But what began during the Carnian stage of the Triassic was something altogether different. It was not a storm, nor even a season of storms. It was a rewriting of the climate itself. The heavens opened, and the world descended into an age of water. The opening act of the deluge seemed ordinary at first. In the dry heartlands of Pangaea, people of that time, had there been any, would have seen dark clouds on the horizon and welcomed the relief. Rivers that had been shallow or empty began to swell with muddy torrents. Dusty plains turned green as dormant seeds awoke at the touch of water. Amphibians spread into new wetlands. Reptiles basked in moist environments that offered abundant food. Insects thrived, filling the air with their buzzing wings. Forests drank deeply, their roots exploring saturated soils. But the rains did not stop. Days stretched into weeks, weeks into months. The air seemed heavy, pressing down with humidity, while the rhythm of wet and dry seasons was erased. Floodwaters lingered where they once drained away, and lowlands began to transform into marshes. The balance had shifted. What could keep the skies pouring for such an impossible length of time? Scientists believe the answer lies in a chain reaction set off by volcanic activity linked to the rifting of Pangaea. When giant volcanic provinces erupted, they spewed vast amounts of carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. The greenhouse effect intensified, trapping more heat near the surface. Warmer temperatures meant oceans evaporated faster, pumping staggering amounts of water vapor into the sky. Water vapor itself is a greenhouse gas, amplifying the warming effect. The more the air heated, the more moisture it held, and the more it rained. Once this cycle began, it was self-sustaining. Each storm carried enough energy to trigger the next, and each drop evaporated back to feed the next downpour. The earth had locked itself into a new, watery state. To witness these skies would have been to see a planet reborn. Thick blankets of clouds stretched horizon to horizon, blotting out the sun. Days were dim, lit only by the filtered glow of sunlight pressing through moisture-laden air. Nights were storm-filled, with lightning flashing across continents in ceaseless arcs. Thunder became the constant soundtrack of life. Rain pounded on leaves, rocks, and soil in an endless drumbeat, carving rivulets that turned to streams, then streams to rivers. Entire valleys became channels of moving water. The air grew heavy with moisture. Breathing must have felt different, laden with humidity. For cold-blooded animals, this was both a blessing and a challenge. Warm and damp conditions were ideal for growth, but also exhausting, draining energy and demanding constant adaptation. Across the interiors of Pangaea, dry deserts dissolved. Where once sands stretched endlessly, grasses, ferns, and pioneer plants began to take hold. Dunes collapsed into muddy plains as roots stabilized wet soil. Ancient river systems overflowed their banks and carved new paths across the continent. Low-lying areas filled, becoming lakes. In some places, entire inland seas formed where none had existed before. Ecosystems reorganized rapidly around these new bodies of water. Amphibians spread explosively, exploiting the endless wetlands. Fish colonized rivers that connected previously isolated basins. But for every opportunity, there was destruction. Creatures adapted to arid life. Reptiles that had thrived in deserts. Plants evolved to store water, found themselves drowning. Eggs laid in sandy soil were swept away. Burrows collapsed. Seeds rotted in waterlogged ground. For many, survival was no longer possible. One of the most dramatic consequences of the 2 million-year rainfall was the elimination of Earth's great deserts. The vast arid interiors of Pangaea, once dominant, were erased. Instead, the supercontinent became a patchwork of forests, wetlands, and swamps. Plants that had relied on dry conditions were replaced by ferns, mosses, and lush vegetation adapted to constant moisture. Forests expanded at unprecedented rates, fueled by abundant water and elevated carbon dioxide levels that enhanced photosynthesis. The Earth became greener than it had been for millions of years. Yet this greening came at a cost. Diversity suffered as specialized desert species vanished. Evolution tends to favor resilience, but in such a drastic climate shift, even resilience has limits. Entire lineages disappeared, their adaptations rendered useless. For animals, survival became a matter of flexibility. Amphibians flourished, their dependence on water finally turning from a weakness into a strength. Frogs and salamander-like creatures spread into nearly every available wetland. Reptiles were more divided. Some perished, unable to cope with damp environments that rotted eggs or drowned nesting grounds. Others adapted. Crocodile-like reptiles thrived in rivers, while early dinosaurs began to rise in numbers, exploiting opportunities left by fallen rivals. Insects exploded in abundance. Moisture fueled plant growth, and plants fueled insect populations. Swarms of dragonflies, beetles, and early pollinators dominated the air. They, in turn, fed amphibians, reptiles, and the first small mammals. The rains, though devastating, were also a crucible of innovation. Those who survived were tested and transformed, laying the groundwork for future ecosystems. The endless rain did not stop at the coasts. Oceans absorbed staggering amounts of fresh water, altering salinity levels and circulation patterns. Marine life felt the change as currents shifted and nutrient flows were disrupted. Shallow seas expanded inland, swallowing coastlines. Coral reefs faced challenges from fluctuating salinity and sediment washed in by swollen rivers. Yet, in this upheaval, new opportunities arose. Fish populations diversified, ammonites flourished, and marine reptiles continued their dominance in shifting seas. The Earth's hydrological cycle, the constant movement of water between air, land, and ocean, was now supercharged, operating at scales unseen before or since. Though rain was constant, fire did not vanish. Lightning storms ignited vegetation, and while much was too damp to burn, certain forests dried in brief breaks between deluges. Fires tore through these areas, releasing smoke that mingled with storm clouds. The cycle of water and fire reshaped landscapes in complex ways, clearing dense forests and allowing new growth to surge. Volcanoes, too, continued their fiery activity. Eruptions poured lava and ash into the wet skies, creating apocalyptic scenes of fire meeting flood. Ash mixed with rain to fall as choking mud, smothering valleys. The earth was, in a sense, both drowning and burning. Though no humans lived to witness it, imagining the psychological toll of endless rain helps us grasp its scale. The loss of sunlight would have disoriented life. Circadian rhythms tied to daylight were disrupted. Animals that relied on sight to hunt or escape predators struggled in dim conditions. Plants accustomed to cycles of sun and shade had to adapt to perpetual cloud cover. In a sense, Earth's identity had shifted. It was no longer a planet of seasons, but a planet of storms. By the time centuries had passed, the transformation was irreversible. Deserts were gone. Wetlands sprawled. Forests had expanded to cover vast tracts of land. Rivers linked across continents, weaving a hydrological network that stretched from one end of Pangaea to the other. The rains were not a pause in Earth's history, but a rewriting of it. Entire ecosystems collapsed. New ones rose. Lineages vanished. Others flourished. Out of this crucible came the first true age of dinosaurs. The storm had cleared the stage, and they were ready to step into the spotlight. The rains had begun as a welcome reprieve for thirsty lands. But centuries into the deluge, the earth was no longer the same place. What had started as storms became the very identity of the planet. By the time the rainfall had persisted for hundreds of thousands of years, deserts were erased, rivers had swollen into seas, and entire ecosystems had been washed away. Earth had drowned, and in its drowning, it was reborn. The transformation of the land was total. The once dry interiors of Pangaea, which had stretched for thousands of kilometers in scorching aridity, were now lush, waterlogged, and unrecognizable. Valleys once filled with dust storms now hosted enormous lakes. Salt flats turned into freshwater basins. Grasslands that had never existed before spread across floodplains, watered by endless rain. In some areas, rainfall was so intense that rivers merged into vast inland seas. These water bodies often lacked outlets to the ocean, and they swelled until evaporation matched rainfall, creating immense inland seas that shimmered under the dim, cloud-draped sky. The continents themselves seemed to groan under the new weight of water. Soil layers loosened, eroded, and flowed into rivers. Entire hillsides collapsed in mudslides. Ancient dunes dissolved into thick clay deposits. Sediments that would one day form stone were being laid down in staggering quantities, preserving a record of this watery age for future geologists. Low-lying regions of Pangaea became immense swamps, stretching farther than any modern counterpart. Imagine an environment larger than today's Amazon rainforest, but wetter, darker, and more humid. Ferns, horsetails, and towering conifers thrived, their growth accelerated by constant moisture and the abundance of carbon dioxide. These swampy expanses were breeding grounds for amphibians, frogs, salamander-like creatures, and other water-dependent animals proliferated in such abundance that their calls must have filled the air, echoing against the roar of constant rainfall. Insects flourished too. Giant dragonflies, beetles, and swarming flies found food in the dense vegetation and endless pools of standing water. Predators followed. Crocodile-like reptiles lurked in murky rivers. Early dinosaurs, nimble and opportunistic, stalked the edges of wetlands, hunting smaller reptiles and amphibians. This was an age where adaptability decided survival, and those capable of thriving in damp, ever-changing environments took center stage. But this lush, water-soaked earth came at a terrible cost. Species that had relied on dry conditions vanished. Reptiles adapted to deserts. Creatures that had once roamed dunes with thick, scaly hides could not survive in waterlogged soils. Plants specialized for arid climates, like cycads with water-conserving adaptations, declined dramatically in many regions. The ecological collapse was profound. Diversity dipped as entire ecosystems disappeared, only to be replaced by new ones suited to the wetter world. Evolution is never fair. Those that cannot adapt vanish, and their place is filled by opportunists. This great replacement of life forms, what scientists call the Carnian pluvial event, marked one of Earth's great turning points. It was a mass extinction, but also a mass opportunity. One of the most striking features of the drowned world was the river systems. With constant rainfall, rivers were swollen beyond recognition. Many never receded, their banks permanently overtaken by torrents of water. Floodplains extended for hundreds of kilometers, covered not by seasonal flooding, but by permanent inundation. Sediment carried by these swollen rivers built immense deltas along the coasts, changing shorelines faster than life could adjust. Nutrient-rich muds spread far and wide, fueling explosive plant growth, but also smothering habitats. For animals, these conditions created both barriers and bridges. Some species were isolated by newly formed rivers and lakes, while others used waterways as migration routes, spreading farther than before. Evolution thrives in such fragmentation, and new species were already beginning to emerge in the chaos. The rain was not confined to land. Oceans, too, felt the burden of 2 million years of downpour. Massive amounts of fresh water poured into seas, diluting their salt levels. This shift in salinity disrupted marine ecosystems, as many organisms are finely tuned to specific salt concentrations. Coral reefs struggled in these conditions, and many collapsed. Yet the oceans also brimmed with life. Ammonites, squid-like creatures with coiled shells, thrived in the changing seas. Marine reptiles dominated the waters, hunting fish that swarmed in nutrient-rich coastal zones. New plankton species flourished in the altered chemistry, laying foundations for future ocean ecosystems. The rain also drove massive sedimentation along coastlines. Whole marine landscapes were buried under mud and silt washed in from rivers. What had once been shallow reefs became layered stone, preserved in time as a fossil record of transformation. Forests expanded in ways unimaginable in the pre-rain world. Constant water and high carbon dioxide levels turned them into lush, towering ecosystems. Conifers grew to staggering heights. Ferns blanketed the ground. Early seed plants proliferated in the damp conditions, experimenting with forms that would dominate later eras. But these forests were unlike today's rainforests. Sunlight was often dim, filtered through thick cloud cover, so plants evolved to thrive in low-light environments. Growth was rapid, but competition was fierce. Trees stretched desperately for what little light broke through. Within these forests lived the early ancestors of future giants, dinosaurs. No longer rare and minor, they began to rise as central players in ecosystems, their adaptability giving them an edge in an unstable world. Though drenched in rain, Earth was not spared from fire. Lightning storms, fueled by immense energy in the atmosphere, ignited forests again and again. Moist conditions kept many fires from spreading far. But when dry intervals arrived, forests that had grown unchecked for decades became fuel for colossal blazes. This cycle of growth and destruction shaped plant communities, encouraging rapid regeneration. Some plants evolved strategies to cope with fire: resilient seeds, thick bark, or the ability to sprout quickly after burns. Evolution accelerated in these storm-filled forests. The endless rain also meant endless clouds. Sunlight was scarce, dimmed by a ceiling of vapor and storm. Days were shorter in brightness, even if not in hours. For plants, this meant a struggle to capture enough energy. For animals, it meant living in a world of perpetual twilight. Predators adapted to hunt in dim light. Prey evolved sharper senses to detect movement in murky conditions. Insects relied less on sight and more on scent or vibration. Life was forced to adjust to a darker planet, where the very rhythm of day and night was blurred. This drowned world was both destructive and creative. Extinctions cleared ecological niches. Survivors innovated to exploit them. Amphibians became dominant in wetlands, but dinosaurs were rising in forests and open floodplains. Reptiles shaped like crocodiles flourished in rivers, but others disappeared forever. Insects and plants co-evolved at breakneck speed. Pollination became more complex, paving the way for future flowering plants. Meanwhile, mammals, tiny and secretive at this time, hid in the undergrowth, already benefiting from the upheaval that removed many reptilian competitors. The earth was in flux. Rain was its sculptor, chiseling away old landscapes and shaping new ones. The rains did not simply pass after a season, or even after centuries. They lasted so long that entire generations of species were born, lived, and vanished without ever knowing a dry season. Evolution itself began to assume constant rain was the norm. 2 million years is enough time for rivers to carve canyons, for lakes to fill and drain, for entire lineages of life to rise and fall. The drowned world was not just a temporary phase, it was an epoch in itself. When the rains finally did end, Earth would be unrecognizable to those who had known it before. The desert-adapted species of the Triassic were gone. In their place stood the early foundations of the ecosystems that would dominate the Mesozoic. The drowned world, though destructive, cleared the stage for the rise of dinosaurs. In wiping out old rivals, in greening the earth with endless wetlands and forests, in testing species to their limits, it created conditions where dinosaurs could thrive. By the time the last storm cloud lifted, the earth was no longer the one that had existed before. It was wetter, greener, and biologically reset. The dinosaurs, once small and marginal, now had room to grow into the giants we remember today. The drowned world was, in many ways, the birthplace of the age of dinosaurs. The rains had transformed the Earth's landscapes into vast wetlands, inland seas, and shadowy forests. Yet beyond the reshaping of land and water, the storms also rewrote the course of evolution. For 2 million years, life was sculpted by constant rain, forcing adaptations that would change the future of ecosystems forever. Evolution thrives on challenge, and few challenges were greater than endless storms. Those that survived learned to bend, not break, under the weight of water. For amphibians, this age was a golden era. These creatures had always been tied to water, their moist skins and soft eggs requiring constant hydration. In the pre-rain world, amphibians were restricted to rivers, lakes, and swampy zones. Now, with rainfall flooding nearly every region, their range expanded dramatically. Frogs, salamanders, and crocodile-like temnospondyls flourished. Their populations surged as wetlands spread, and they became some of the most numerous animals of the drowned world. Some species grew to impressive sizes, supported by abundant prey and oxygen-rich water. Adaptations followed quickly. Many amphibians developed stronger lungs and thicker skins to withstand extended time in shallow, oxygen-poor waters. Others diversified into specialized niches. Burrowing amphibians that hid in wet soils, tree-dwelling frogs that clung to rain-soaked branches, and aquatic hunters that prowled the new lakes and rivers. For millions of years, amphibians were at the center of food chains, thriving in ways they never had before and never would again on such a scale. Reptiles faced a mixed fate in this storm-driven world. Many species, adapted to dry conditions, struggled. Their hard-shelled eggs, designed to survive on land, often failed in soggy, unstable soils. Nests drowned and populations declined. Desert dwellers, once successful across Pangaea's vast arid interiors, found no refuge. But not all reptiles fell. Those with flexibility adapted and thrived. Crocodile-like archosaurs emerged as dominant predators in rivers and wetlands. Their bodies, streamlined for swimming, and jaws lined with teeth, made them perfect hunters of amphibians and fish. Early dinosaurs also found their opportunity. At the start of the rains, they were small, two-legged hunters and scavengers, overshadowed by larger reptilian rivals. But as those rivals perished in the flood-driven extinctions, dinosaurs exploited open niches. Their lightweight skeletons, efficient lungs, and active metabolisms gave them an edge in stormy, low-light environments. By the time the rains ended, dinosaurs had shifted from marginal players to rising stars. Evolution had quietly crowned its next rulers. Insects exploded in abundance during the 2 million-year rainfall. Constant moisture fueled plant growth, and plants in turn fed insect populations. Forests buzzed with beetles, dragonflies, and early pollinators. Adaptations appeared quickly. Many insects evolved waterproof coatings to survive in humid, storm-soaked environments. Wings became stronger and more resilient, able to endure rain and turbulence. Some species grew larger, taking advantage of oxygen-rich air and abundant food. Pollination strategies became more complex, forging tighter bonds between plants and insects. These evolutionary experiments would eventually lay the foundation for flowering plants, though they had not yet appeared. Insects also became the foundation of food webs, sustaining amphibians, reptiles, and the first small mammals. Their success made them both vital and vulnerable. When rains shifted ecosystems, insect populations often dictated which larger animals survived. Plants were perhaps the most profoundly transformed by the endless rains. The expansion of forests reshaped Earth's appearance and atmosphere. Ferns and horsetails spreading carpets across floodplains, thriving in waterlogged soils. Conifers dominated higher, slightly drier ground, their towering forms creating new canopy ecosystems. Moisture-loving plants evolved adaptations to cope with near-constant saturation. Some developed root systems specialized for oxygen-poor soils. Others evolved flexible stems to withstand flooding or currents. Yet not all plants prospered. Species adapted to drought. Thick-leaved cycads, for example, declined in many regions. Seeds that relied on dry conditions for dispersal failed. Evolution had no mercy for those that clung too tightly to the old world. The rain did more than shape ecosystems. It altered the very chemistry of the atmosphere. Explosive plant growth absorbed vast amounts of carbon dioxide, gradually cooling the climate even as volcanoes continued to release gases. Life itself was helping to reset the balance. Within the expanding forests, predators evolved to master the stormy world. Early dinosaurs like Coelophysis, small and agile, thrived as hunters of insects, amphibians, and small reptiles. Their lightweight frames and sharp senses made them well suited to a dim, rain-filled environment. Crocodile-like reptiles lurked along rivers, ambushing prey in floodplains. Some grew to massive sizes, their dominance unchallenged in aquatic realms. Flying insects drew new predators too. Early pterosaurs, the first vertebrates to master flight, took to the skies. These leathery winged reptiles exploited the abundance of insects, gliding between storms and snatching prey in mid-air. Evolution had found its first true flyers. The storm world had created new arenas for predators, and they filled them with remarkable speed. Amid the noise of dinosaurs, amphibians, and reptiles, tiny mammal ancestors also endured the storm. These creatures, small and nocturnal, relied on keen senses and burrowing habits to survive. The endless rainfall forced them into sheltered niches, often underground or within dense vegetation. While they did not dominate during this time, their survival strategies, small size, adaptability, and efficient metabolisms ensured their persistence. In the long story of evolution, their endurance through the storm prepared them for futures where they would eventually rise. 2 million years of rain was more than a climate event. It was an evolutionary experiment. Stress drives adaptation, and in this crucible of storms, innovation flourished. Amphibians grew larger and more specialized than at any point in history. Reptiles split into survivors and casualties, with crocodile-like archosaurs and dinosaurs advancing. Insects became hyper-diverse, forging the first great pollination systems. Plants reshaped the world into forests, altering the atmosphere itself. Mammal ancestors endured quietly, waiting for their distant day of dominance. The rains were not simply destructive, they were creative, forcing life to evolve in directions it never would have taken otherwise. As the rains continued, ecosystems stabilized into their new forms. Wetlands sprawled, forests darkened, and rivers never ceased flowing. Life had adapted, but in doing so, it had become something new. When the storms finally ended after 2 million years, Earth was utterly changed. Amphibians had peaked and would slowly fade. Dinosaurs stood ready to rise to their true dominance. Insects had set the stage for flowering plants. Mammal ancestors had quietly endured. The storm had been both a scythe and a sculptor, cutting down the old and carving the new. Endless rainfall was not merely a background event. It was a force that dictated every choice, every adaptation, every fragile chance of survival. Across continents, drenched in perpetual downpour, creatures of every size found themselves tested in ways no earlier generation could have imagined. Survival was no longer about seasonal shifts or short-term storms. It was about enduring a climate that had become a weapon, reshaping landscapes daily, erasing the familiar, and demanding resilience from every living being. The first victims of the deluge were the specialists, the organisms that had evolved for balance and predictability. Amphibians, once rulers of wetlands, faced paradoxical struggles. Water should have been their ally, yet constant flooding disrupted their delicate reproductive cycles. Eggs laid in still ponds were washed away by surging streams. Tadpoles, dependent on stable shallows, were swept into torrents or stranded in unstable floodplains. Only those that adapted quickly, finding crevices, burrows, or hidden pools resistant to floods, could maintain their fragile foothold. Burrowing became one of nature's most effective answers to the crisis. Many small creatures, from insects to early reptiles, began retreating underground. Within soil saturated by constant rain, they carved tunnels and chambers shielded from the pounding above. Though the ground was never dry, these subterranean refuges offered stability, damp, dark, but free from the chaos raging on the surface. Roots of drowned forests provided scaffolding for these hidden communities, turning decaying wood into shelters. In time, life beneath the earth became just as busy and diverse as life once was above. For larger creatures, survival required mobility and flexibility. Herbivores faced the loss of stable grazing lands as forests collapsed and plains turned to mud. Those that could browse on water-tolerant plants, feeding on ferns and mosses rather than towering trees, gained an advantage. Carnivores, meanwhile, were forced into constant migration, following the movements of dwindling prey herds through drowned valleys and new wetlands. Opportunism became a survival trait. Animals that could switch diets, alter habitats, and exploit temporary resources were more likely to endure. Insects thrived more than any other group. Rain created an explosion of stagnant pools, breeding grounds for mosquitoes, midges, and countless water-dependent species. Swarms filled the air, buzzing clouds that tormented larger animals and spread pathogens. Yet these same swarms became lifelines for predators. Amphibians snapping at insects from flooded banks, reptiles gorging on the abundance, even early birds finding opportunities in the buzzing skies. In a world stripped of stability, insects became both plague and salvation, tipping survival toward those who could exploit their abundance. Disease also became a silent force of transformation. Warm, humid conditions allowed fungi, molds, and microbes to flourish. Plants already weakened by waterlogged roots succumbed quickly to fungal infestations. Animals forced into crowded refuges spread pathogens rapidly. Epidemics swept through populations, culling the weak and ensuring only the hardiest survived. Over time, these pressures shaped lineages, favoring those with stronger immune defenses and resilience to parasites. Amidst this constant struggle, cooperation emerged as a rare but vital strategy. Small creatures often found safety in numbers, gathering in clusters beneath fallen logs or within sheltered crevices. Mutual survival instincts, warning calls, shared burrows, coordinated foraging helped them persist against relentless challenges. Evolution began quietly rewarding not just the strong, but the adaptable, the flexible, and even the social. Through it all, the skies never relented. Day after day, year after year, water poured from above in an unbroken cycle. Yet in that very adversity lay opportunity. The storm did not extinguish life. It redirected it, sculpting survivors into forms better suited for endurance. Every adaptation, every tiny victory, was a step toward resilience in a world where the storm itself had become the ecosystem. Evolution does not happen in silence. It is written into every generation, every subtle shift in survival, every choice of which traits endure and which vanish. The 2 million years of endless rainfall became one of the most powerful evolutionary laboratories in Earth's history. Where some lineages collapsed, others adapted and flourished, their transformations forever altering the trajectory of life. The storm acted as a sieve. Species unable to cope with constant flooding, unstable soils, or reduced sunlight vanished, leaving ecological space open for newcomers. In that vacuum, the survivors found room to expand, diversify, and innovate. Rain was no longer simply a burden. It was the architect of new possibilities. Reptiles, already equipped with waterproof scales and resilient eggs, fared better than most. Yet the storm did not let them remain unchanged. Floodplains and expanding wetlands, selected for those capable of swimming, diving, or living semi-aquatic lives. Limbs became stronger and more paddle-like in certain lineages. Eyes and nostrils shifted upward, allowing creatures to see and breathe while half submerged. Carnivorous reptiles turned increasingly amphibious, hunting both on land and in water. Some developed patience as their greatest weapon, lying motionless beneath flooded surfaces before striking at prey. Others exploited the abundant fish and amphibians displaced by swollen rivers, blending reptilian toughness with aquatic grace. The rains did not merely test reptiles. They accelerated their spread into niches once unreachable. For amphibians, the rains posed a paradox. They were water-dependent, yet endless water threatened their very survival. Many species perished, but those that endured underwent profound change. Some evolved eggs with tougher coatings, less vulnerable to being swept away. Others shortened developmental stages, allowing tadpoles to metamorphose more quickly before floods could disperse them. A few even bypassed the tadpole stage altogether, giving rise to direct developing species capable of hatching into miniature adults. These innovations reshaped amphibians into forms more resilient than their ancestors. While they never regained the dominance they once held, they persisted, leaving descendants that would echo through Earth's history. Perhaps no group benefited more dramatically than insects. Rain provided endless breeding grounds, and those capable of exploiting waterlogged environments exploded in diversity. Mosquitoes, flies, dragonflies, and countless aquatic larvae filled pools, streams, and floodplains. Their abundance rippled upward through food webs, fueling the survival of amphibians, reptiles, and early birds. The constant humidity also allowed fragile species, such as delicate winged insects, to thrive without fear of desiccation. Whole new lineages adapted to life in dampness, colonizing niches that had never existed before. Their success not only shaped the storm-bound ecosystems, but also laid evolutionary groundwork for future expansions once the rains ceased. Plants, too, were forced into new directions, with towering forests collapsing. Low-growing vegetation seized dominance. Ferns diversified, producing countless varieties suited to varying degrees of light and saturation. Mosses spread into vast green carpets across drowned valleys, stabilizing soils and creating habitats for insects and small animals. Some plants began forming mutualistic relationships with fungi and bacteria that thrived in saturated soils. These partnerships allowed them to access nutrients otherwise locked away in waterlogged ground. Others developed adaptations to float, producing seeds or spores capable of dispersing on floodwaters, ensuring their lineage reached new territories. The relentless rainfall stripped away old ecological rules and forced the rise of pioneers. These new plant communities would outlast the storm, becoming ancestors of lineages that shaped landscapes long after skies cleared. At the microscopic scale, evolution unfolded at dizzying speed. Bacteria adapted to oxygen-poor floodwaters, inventing new metabolisms that thrived in stagnant conditions. Methane-producing microbes expanded, altering atmospheric chemistry. Fungi developed resilience to constant moisture, finding ways to penetrate and digest even the toughest plant tissues. These unseen innovators influenced everything else. By recycling nutrients, they sustained new ecosystems in places where larger plants and animals faltered. By shifting atmospheric gases, they helped determine the very pace and eventual end of the endless storm. What unified these diverse evolutionary stories was pressure, the relentless, inescapable pressure of rain. For 2 million years, every creature lived under the same unbroken challenge. Those that bent to it reshaped themselves or discovered hidden advantages not only survived but prospered. Those that clung to the past vanished. Evolution in the storm was not gradual. It was accelerated, compressed, and sharpened by hardship. In this way, the endless rainfall became more than a catastrophe. It was a forge, melting down old patterns and reforging life into new and resilient forms. While overarching trends shape the course of evolution, the story of survival is best told through individual lineages and their remarkable adaptations. In the drowned world, nature's inventiveness manifested in myriad ways, each species responding to the unrelenting rain with strategies that would echo through deep time. Some reptiles became specialists in navigating the flooded landscapes. Consider a lineage of small archosaur cousins. Their limbs elongated, slightly flattened, allowing them to swim efficiently across swollen rivers and floodplains. Eyes and nostrils migrated toward the tops of their heads, giving them the ability to breathe and see while most of the body remained submerged. These reptiles were not apex predators, but opportunistic hunters. They feasted on amphibians, insects, and fish washed downstream by surging rivers. Their flexibility gave them a survival advantage over purely terrestrial species, and over generations, these semi-aquatic adaptations became fixed in their DNA. Evolution, in this sense, was both directional and opportunistic, favoring traits that turned catastrophe into opportunity. Amphibians, though challenged by constant flooding, evolved astonishing reproductive strategies. Certain species developed eggs with thicker, water-resistant coatings, preventing them from being destroyed by torrents. Others accelerated development, transforming tadpoles into adults before floods could sweep them away. A few lineages bypassed the tadpole stage entirely, hatching miniature adults capable of immediate mobility. These changes, though subtle in individual lifetimes, compounded over millennia, producing lineages remarkably resilient to waterlogged conditions. Amphibians, once vulnerable, became enduring participants in the storm-bound ecosystems. Insects capitalized on the new environment like no other group. Pools of stagnant water became breeding grounds for mosquitoes, dragonflies, and countless aquatic larvae. Their sheer abundance fed amphibians, reptiles, and early mammals, stabilizing food webs even as larger predators struggled. Some insects developed waterproof coatings on wings and bodies, allowing them to survive unbroken rainstorms. Others adapted to cling to floating vegetation, riding mats of debris across floodplains to colonize new areas. Insects were not merely survivors. They became architects of ecological continuity, enabling higher organisms to endure in a landscape dominated by water. Pollination, though primitive, began to show complexity. Early plant-insect interactions formed in subtle ways, with insects carrying spores and pollen from plant to plant across saturated landscapes. These relationships set the stage for later floral evolution, demonstrating that adaptation during catastrophe can lay the groundwork for future innovation. Plants face both death and opportunity in the flooded world. Tall trees often succumbed to root rot and soil instability, while low-lying vegetation thrived. Ferns, mosses, and liverworts expanded, carpeting vast landscapes and stabilizing soils against erosion. Floating plants evolved new dispersal methods, sending seeds and spores along currents to colonize distant floodplains. Some formed symbiotic relationships with fungi, allowing them to extract nutrients from waterlogged soils where others failed. The rains, destructive as they were, promoted ecological experimentation, favoring forms that could survive constant wetness while exploiting nutrients released by decayed vegetation. Flooding altered predator-prey interactions dramatically. Amphibians and small reptiles became both hunters and hunted, their habitats constantly shifting. Predators adapted with patience. Ambush strategies dominated over pursuit, as floods reshaped terrain faster than most species could traverse. Some carnivorous reptiles evolved semi-aquatic hunting techniques, lying in wait along submerged banks. Birds, small and agile, exploited swarms of insects in dimly lit forests. The relentless rains favored those capable of behavioral flexibility, rewarding ingenuity over brute strength. 2 million years of unbroken rain imposed a filter on life that favored resilience above all else. Species that adapted to flooding, darkness, and resource unpredictability survived and diversified. Those clinging to pre-storm habits perished, leaving ecological space open for innovation. Life on Earth became both hardened and versatile. The storm selected for traits that allowed mobility in waterlogged landscapes, tolerance of low light, and rapid reproductive cycles. The planet itself became a shaping force, guiding evolution in ways that no single organism could achieve alone. After 2 million years of unbroken rain, the skies finally began to clear. It was not a sudden stop, but a gradual tapering. As climatic systems shifted and Earth slowly adjusted, rivers began to recede, floodplains drained, and lakes shrank. The relentless roar of water softened into the occasional storm. The planet, long drowned and turbulent, had entered a new chapter, a world no longer defined by ceaseless rain, but by the scars and innovations left in its wake. The aftermath revealed a planet almost unrecognizable to its pre-storm inhabitants. Floodplains stretched for hundreds of kilometers where deserts had once ruled. Coastal regions were permanently reshaped by sediment deposits carried by millennia of torrents. Mountains had lost slopes to erosion. Valleys were filled with thick layers of alluvial mud, and inland seas that had expanded during the rains gradually receded, leaving behind lakes, swamps, and marshes. The soil was richer in some places, enriched by layers of decayed organic matter, yet unstable in others, prone to sudden collapses and landslides. The scars of the storm dictated where life could take root and where it would struggle. This was a world of opportunity, yet also a world of caution. The rains had reset the rules of survival. Plants that had endured the storm now dominate newly drained landscapes. Ferns and mosses, long adapted to wet, low-light conditions, had created vast green carpets, stabilizing soils and providing habitats for small animals. Low-lying shrubs and pioneering flowering plants began to spread across open floodplains, exploiting niches created by fallen forests. Conifers, once weakened by waterlogged roots, began to recover in slightly higher, better drained areas. These survivors would form the backbone of new forests for millennia, providing structure and shade for evolving ecosystems. The rains had eliminated many species, but also promoted a surge of innovation. Plants that had adapted to flooding were now primed to expand in the post-storm world. The survivors of the storm were not simply the ones lucky enough to endure. They were the ones most suited to flexibility, resilience, and opportunism. Semi-aquatic reptiles and amphibians found that their adaptations for flooded landscapes remained advantageous even as waters receded. Those with improved swimming, climbing, or burrowing abilities could exploit new niches created by shifting terrain. Early dinosaurs, once small and marginal, had gained a foothold during the storm. Freed from many reptilian competitors, they began to diversify and increase in size. Their success was due not only to adaptability, but also to the evolutionary gaps left behind by the extinction of less versatile species. Insects continued to play a central role. Swarms that had dominated the drowned world became essential for pollination and as a food source for recovering amphibians and reptiles. Many species that had flourished during constant rainfall were now poised to expand further in the new mosaic of forests, wetlands, and open plains. Microorganisms, though invisible to most eyes, remained foundational. Bacteria and fungi had maintained nutrient cycles throughout the storm. Their ability to recycle decayed plant and animal matter ensured that soils remained fertile and ready for recolonization. Methane-producing and oxygen-generating microbes had subtly altered the atmosphere, contributing to long-term stabilization and the eventual moderation of climate. Microbes, in their quiet persistence, had ensured continuity in a world otherwise dominated by chaos. Their presence made it possible for higher life to rebuild, demonstrating the power of the microscopic world in shaping macro-scale evolution. The storm had acted as both destroyer and teacher. It eliminated species that clung to rigidity while rewarding those that innovated. The post-rain era was a world of ecological reset. Previously dominant lineages had been replaced, while survivors thrived in ways that set the stage for future diversification. Wetlands gave way to marshes and seasonal floodplains, while forests reclaimed hills and valleys. Grasslands began to appear in some regions, prepared by sediment deposition and new soil chemistry. Rivers established stable courses once more, allowing animals to migrate and colonize previously submerged areas. The end of the rains marked the beginning of a rapid evolutionary expansion. Animals that had survived in niche habitats during the storm now moved into open areas, exploiting untapped food sources. Predators diversified their hunting strategies, while herbivores explored new plant communities. Early mammals, still small and nocturnal, found expanded territories to exploit, laying the foundation for future dominance. Amphibians and reptiles, tested by millennia of water and darkness, retained adaptations that gave them long-term advantages. Certain lineages of semi-aquatic reptiles, for example, became apex predators in newly stabilized rivers and lakes. The innovations forged under relentless rainfall now define the trajectory of the next era of life on Earth. Earth's climate, once dominated by constant storms, gradually reached a new equilibrium. Atmospheric humidity decreased, seasonal cycles returned, and sunlight penetrated more frequently to the surface. These changes created an environment more familiar to modern organisms, yet still distinctly shaped by the memory of 2 million years of rain. The stabilization allowed ecosystems to mature. Forests thickened, wetlands consolidated, and coastal systems established more permanent shorelines. Life, having endured and adapted, now expanded with greater complexity. By the time the post-storm world fully stabilized, the stage was set for the rise of the Mesozoic's iconic creatures. Dinosaurs, amphibians, and reptiles that had endured the storm now dominated the land. Plants, having adapted to flooding, formed resilient forests and marshes that would sustain new waves of evolution. Insects and microbes had cemented ecological processes that ensured continuity across generations. The rains, though destructive, had prepared Earth for a new chapter. They had cleared old dominances, forced innovation, and shaped life into forms ready to thrive in changing environments. The aftermath of the storm was not a return to the past. It was a launching point for the future. The world that emerged after the end of the 2-million-year deluge was a landscape both scarred and fertile. Where floods had scoured valleys and deposited thick layers of mud and sediment, new habitats took shape. Swamps gave way to marshes and seasonal wetlands. Rivers carved stable courses, and uplands, once eroded and battered, became refuges for life. Life itself, having endured the relentless rain, now began the process of reclaiming the land in earnest. Plants were the first to re-establish order on the recovering landscape. Ferns and mosses, already abundant during the storm, extended their dominance across drained floodplains. Their dense mats stabilized the soil, preventing erosion and creating microhabitats for insects and small animals. Early shrubs and pioneering conifers began to reclaim higher ground, their roots anchoring the terrain and forming the skeleton of new forests. This period saw the rise of plant diversity as species that had survived the floods expanded into open niches. Adaptations developed during the storm, such as water-resistant spores, rapid growth cycles, and symbioses with fungi, gave these plants a competitive advantage. New vegetation patterns laid the foundation for complex ecosystems, forming layered forests, open marshes, and emergent riverbanks that would support a diversity of life for millennia. Amphibians, refined by the pressures of constant flooding, thrived in newly stabilized wetlands. Species that had survived the storm retained adaptations that allowed them to exploit the abundance of food and shelter. Thick-skinned, quick-developing, and resilient to fluctuating water levels, these amphibians became integral components of post-storm ecosystems, both as predators and prey. Reptiles, particularly the semi-aquatic and opportunistic forms that had survived the deluge, expanded into vacant ecological niches. Crocodile-like archosaurs and small predatory reptiles grew in number, controlling populations of amphibians and smaller creatures. Dinosaurs, small and unremarkable during the storm, now began to rise in prominence. Freed from previous competitors, they diversified in size, diet, and ecological role. This was the early stage of what would eventually become the Mesozoic dominance of dinosaurs. Insects continued to play a vital role in ecosystem recovery. Swarms that had flourished in stagnant pools during the storm now spread across new habitats, facilitating pollination, seed dispersal, and nutrient cycling. The relationships formed between plants and insects during the storm matured, allowing ecosystems to stabilize and expand. Many insects developed new behaviors to exploit the post-storm world. Some specialized in burrowing into the soft, nutrient-rich soils of drained floodplains. Others colonized canopy layers, hunting smaller prey and serving as food for amphibians, reptiles, and early birds. The insect population boom acted as both a catalyst for diversification and a stabilizing force in recovering ecosystems. Small mammalian ancestors, which had survived the storm largely by hiding and nocturnal activity, now began to explore broader habitats. Their flexibility and ability to exploit a wide range of food sources allowed them to expand steadily, though they remained secondary players in a world dominated by amphibians, reptiles, and insects. These early mammals' adaptations, including keen senses, small size, and rapid reproduction, would eventually become crucial in shaping future ecosystems. In the aftermath of the storm, their patience and resilience allowed them to survive and prepare for evolutionary opportunities that lay ahead. With the return of more stable ecosystems, predator-to-prey relationships became more structured. Flood-adapted reptiles and amphibians established hunting territories along rivers and wetlands, while dinosaurs and other emerging predators explored uplands and open plains. Opportunistic feeding strategies, honed during the storm, continued to provide survival advantages. Predators, capable of exploiting multiple food sources, fish, amphibians, insects, and smaller reptiles, thrived, while specialists remained vulnerable to environmental fluctuations. This dynamic created a balanced ecosystem in which food webs became increasingly complex and interconnected. The post-storm world featured increasingly stratified ecosystems. Forests developed layered canopies. Wetlands contained deep and shallow zones, and floodplains became interspersed with marshes, ponds, and open plains. Each habitat type fostered unique communities of plants, insects, amphibians, reptiles, and mammals. Vertical stratification, in particular, became an important aspect of survival. Arboreal reptiles and insects exploited canopy layers, while burrowing amphibians and mammals relied on subterranean refuges. Aquatic predators patrolled rivers and lakes, while terrestrial predators explored open lands. Life was no longer uniform. It had diversified and specialized in response to the pressures of both the storm and its aftermath. The 2-million-year rainfall had reshaped life in ways that extended far beyond its duration. Species that survived the storm were those capable of resilience, adaptation, and ecological flexibility. The post-storm period did not simply restore the pre-storm world. It built a new foundation, one that was more robust, complex, and prepared for future evolutionary challenges. The rains had acted as both a destroyer and a sculptor. They eliminated inflexible species, reshaped habitats, and accelerated evolutionary innovation. The ecosystems that emerged were stronger, more interconnected, and filled with organisms primed to exploit the opportunities of a new world. As decades turned to centuries, ecosystems settled into relative stability. Rivers established permanent courses, forests matured, and wetlands stabilized. Predators and prey established territories, reproductive cycles normalized, and plant communities formed intricate symbiotic networks with insects and microbes. Life, though forever marked by the memory of endless storms, had reclaimed the land with renewed vigor. Adaptations forged under extreme pressure became permanent traits, ensuring that future generations would be capable of thriving in diverse and challenging environments. The post-storm world was not merely recovery, it was a renaissance of life, a stage set for the evolutionary leaps that would define the next great era on Earth. With the relentless rains finally over and ecosystems stabilizing, life on Earth entered a period of reconstruction and expansion. The scars of the storm remain etched across landscapes, but in those scars lay opportunities. Species that had survived 2 million years of flooding now face new ecological possibilities. Evolution, having been accelerated by adversity, was poised to drive life into uncharted territory. Dinosaurs, which had existed in small numbers during the storm, now began to diversify dramatically. Freed from competitors who had perished in the floods, they expanded into forests, plains, and wetlands. Small, agile predators that had survived in niche habitats began to exploit open floodplains, hunting insects, amphibians, and other reptiles. Herbivorous dinosaurs also emerged in greater numbers. Species capable of consuming low-lying ferns and early shrubs thrived in the recovering landscapes. The constant challenge of waterlogged soils had favored adaptability in feeding strategies, and these traits now allowed dinosaurs to exploit a wider variety of plants. Over generations, size variation became more pronounced. Some lineages grew into towering giants, capable of defending themselves against predators, while others remained small and fast, exploiting niches that larger species could not access. Evolution had prepared them for flexibility, and the post-storm world became a stage for their rise. Amphibians, honed by millennia of flood adaptation, stabilized in wetlands and along rivers. Those that had developed rapid reproduction, durable eggs, and tolerance for fluctuating water levels became mainstays of the ecosystem. Reptiles, particularly semi-aquatic and opportunistic forms, expanded across rivers, lakes, and coastal areas. The surviving species carried forward traits forged under the storm. Strong swimming abilities, patience in hunting, and the capacity to exploit multiple habitats were now permanent advantages. Evolution had favored resilience, and these lineages were now positioned to dominate their ecological niches. Though still relatively inconspicuous, small mammals began to explore new territories in the post-storm era. Nocturnal and burrowing habits, which had ensured survival during flooding, now allowed them to occupy diverse environments with minimal competition from larger reptiles. Early mammals adapted to exploit insects, seeds, and small plants, laying the foundation for future ecological significance. Their resilience and flexibility, traits honed under extreme conditions, became central to their long-term survival and eventual diversification. Vegetation in the post-storm world became increasingly structured. Ferns and mosses continued to dominate wetlands, but shrubs and conifers established forested uplands. Early angiosperms, still rare, began to appear, slowly experimenting with new reproductive strategies and habitats. Plant adaptations forged under flooding, rapid growth, spore dispersal, water resistance, allowed species to colonize multiple niches. Forests became layered, providing canopy, understory, and ground-level diversity. Wetlands matured into complex ecosystems that supported a wide array of amphibians, reptiles, and insects. Insects remained essential architects of post-storm ecosystems. Their abundance ensured pollination, seed dispersal, and the cycling of nutrients. Swarms that had once dominated stagnant pools now spread across forests, wetlands, and plains. Predator-prey relationships stabilized, and insects became integral to the emerging balance of life. The storm had favored species capable of rapid reproduction, mobility, and flexibility. These traits now defined the insect community, providing a steady and reliable food source for amphibians, reptiles, birds, and mammals. Insects had not only survived, they had become ecosystem engineers. Predatory dynamics shifted in the recovering world. Semi-aquatic reptiles and early dinosaurs explored open floodplains, hunting both terrestrial and aquatic prey. Amphibians exploited wetlands, feeding on insects and smaller reptiles. Opportunistic strategies, developed under extreme conditions, became dominant behaviors, allowing species to exploit multiple food sources. This flexibility created balanced ecosystems. Predators controlled prey populations. Herbivores maintained plant communities, and insects facilitated nutrient cycling. The post-storm world, though still shaped by past chaos, was now capable of supporting increasingly complex food webs. The combined effects of survival, adaptation, and post-storm expansion set the stage for the Mesozoic era. Dinosaurs were prepared to dominate terrestrial ecosystems. Mammals had established footholds, and plants had created the structural diversity necessary for complex habitats. Insects and microbes ensured the continuity of essential ecological processes. Life had been tested and tempered by catastrophe. The storms, while destructive, had acted as evolutionary accelerators. Traits that promoted survival under extreme conditions became permanent features of species, allowing them to exploit new opportunities and dominate diverse landscapes. The world emerging from the storm was both familiar and transformed. Floodplains, marshes, and forests provided new homes. Rivers and lakes supported aquatic life. Forest canopies offered protection and hunting grounds. Early mammals, reptiles, amphibians, and insects had adapted to exploit these resources efficiently. This period of stability and expansion was brief in geological terms, but profound in evolutionary impact. Life, having endured 2 million years of unrelenting rain, was now resilient, flexible, and ready to dominate Earth's next chapter. The storm had ended, but its legacy persisted in the traits, behaviors, and ecosystems that would define the Mesozoic.